So you may be wondering, how do we distribute apps on the App Store and what goes into that? Well, distributing your app on the App Store is a critical process. Now, it's not one that can be done easily, and it's not one that we can show you end to end, as deploying applications to the App Store requires a lot of additional meta work. Meta meaning that you have to fill in a lot of documentation, you have to put together a lot of resources, you have to look at so many different aspects of your app. But what we do want to give you is the general guidelines that you can go through in order to get your app in the right state to deploy to the App Store and Play Store. Meaning that we're just going to show you how to build a standalone app, create that native build that you can then supply to the App Store and the Play Store. When it comes to the eventual submission process, that is something that we cannot show you, and we do not recommend that you go through with either Meals to Go or Focus Time, as neither app is really set up to be submitted to the App Store, as they are just test apps for learning purposes. Now, you could go and adjust Focus Time or Meals to Go and build out a more rigorous and more well-rounded implementation of all of the different features. And you could try to submit that to the App Store. But at the end of the day, the submission process is one tailored to both platforms. Both iOS and Android have very different requirements in terms of the process you need to follow. Expo has amazing documentation on how to deploy your app to the App Store, what best practices to follow. They have an installation guide for setting up Windows in order to do the builds, and that you have the ability to really understand how to generate these builds, as well as Expo is going to manage the builds for both iOS and Android. So it doesn't really matter if you're on Windows, Linux, or otherwise. As long as you set up your system correctly, you can generate the build and Expo will do the rest for you. Now, knowing that, if you choose to build for iOS or Android, what we're going to show you is solely the basics of generating that build output that you can then go and use to follow along the documentation of the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to go through the submission process. But getting that native build is the biggest step and biggest hurdle that you will need in order to set yourself up for success when going through that submission process. And so we'll be showing you part of the Expo documentation that takes you through that. And you can always reach back to the documentation in order to set yourself up for success, as well as go to the Expo help and guidelines section, the Expo GitHub. They have a lot of resources if something happens to your build or things are going wrong. But again, do not try to deploy either Meals to Go or Focus Time to the App Store. They are not set up in order to be accepted to the App Store. They are solely learning materials. You can, however, adapt them and adjust them in order to try to go through this process. But again, we will not be helping you go through the individual processes of filling out all of the documentation for Android and iOS. This is merely setting you up for success in order to understand what all goes into it. With that whole prelude, you may be wondering to yourself, well, what exactly are we going to then learn in this section, Mo? Well, let's break that down. Let's break that down so that you understand exactly what you're going to get out of this section. Currently, our app is managed by Expo, so we're running our entire app inside of the Expo infrastructure. In order for us to go to the App Store and the Google Play Store, we need to do something special because currently Expo is kind of the manager of our application. So we need to take what Expo has and we need to output a bundle, a package, so to speak, that the App Store will understand and that the Google Play Store will understand. Now, for the App Store, this is called an IPA file. And for the Android Store, this is called an APK file. And so both of these files are specific to the platform that they will run on. One runs on iOS, the other runs on Android. The output of the bundle that we're trying to generate, we are generating through Expo. Expo is managing this for us. But we have to tell Expo what it's going to build, whether it's going to build for iOS or whether it's going to build for Android. And by doing this, Expo will then give us the outputted package. And what we subsequently need to do is understand where we need to go in order to manage the release process. For the Play Store, we will show you where exactly you can go through the process of doing the release. For the App Store, we will also show you how App Store Connect works. And subsequently, once you know all of these individual steps, you can go and deepen your knowledge on specifically what the release procedures takes, what the common pitfalls are, and understand what exactly you need to do by better educating yourself. But having that end-to-end flow, seeing how you can take our Expo app and generate these output files, and then knowing subsequently where to target what you need to do is enough of a foundation to then go and deepen your knowledge and investigate on your own what specifically you should do for the apps that you then want to release once you go and build an app. Because in most scenarios, in most established companies, the process of releasing to the App Store has already been established. And the process of deploying to the Google Play Store has also already been established. But it's good to have that foundational knowledge of what exactly goes into that process and investigating subsequently on your own. If you wanted to release your own app, knowing where to target these things can be fundamentally important. So we want to show you the basics of generating these output files and then showing you where exactly you can start your journey. Now that we understand the steps that we need to go through, the first thing we need to look at is, well, how are we going to build a standalone app? Because currently our app is mainly running inside of this Expo interface. So getting it outside of that Expo interface is something that we need to focus on. Now, the purpose of this guide inside of Expo is to help us understand how to create the standalone binaries. Binaries? What is a binary? Well, a binary is an output. So think of it like a little box. And in that box, we're going to put everything we need for iOS and everything we need for Android in order to run our app as an app itself on the phone instead of running it inside of Expo, right? We want it to show up here on this screen as its standalone app. So we're going to be building what we call binaries of our iOS and Android app that eventually can be submitted to the App Store and the Play Store. Now, something that you need to understand here is that in order to do this, Apple has something called an Apple developer account, which you need in order to build iOS standalone apps. But the Google Play developer account is not needed to build the Android standalone app. So we're looking at different sets of requirements here. Apple has a way more strict environment when it comes to deploying applications. They require you to pay for a developer account. They require you to have an iOS device. Android, however, can run on Linux, Mac, Windows, it doesn't really matter. And you don't really need the Play developer account in order to build your Android app. They just let you do it out of the box. Now, if you'd like to submit either app to the App Store, you do need that developer account. So the difference here is iOS, you need the developer account to build it locally and even submit it. Google, you don't need the Google Play developer account to build it locally, but you do need it to submit to the store. So it's a good idea to read the best practices of deploying to the app stores to ensure that our app is in good shape. But the difference here is that now that we've reached the point at which we're going to deploy, we're coming into contact with the differences of the different environments, right? We're coming into contact with how Apple works versus how Google works. And so when we look at these differences, this is when a lot of the meta work starts. Meta meaning that we have to do a lot of due diligence and make sure that we're building for the right platform, that we have the right things set in place, that we have the right accounts set up and all of that good stuff. And that's, again, one of the reasons that we want you to just follow along, because getting an Apple developer account, first of all, costs $99 a year. So when we go through the process of looking at how to build these standalone apps, the first thing we need is to install the Expo CLI. Well, good thing we installed that when we started off our journey. So we have the Expo CLI. Now, if you haven't created an Expo account, you should create one when running the build command, because what that's going to do is it's going to link that build to your account inside of your project here, right? So you'll have a project, Meals to Go, and it'll link the build to your project once we go through and build it. Windows users must additionally have WSL installed. Now, this is Windows Subsystem Linux. So it's an additional step that you need to go through on Windows in order to go through the management procedure of being able to build. That's why we suggest follow along and understand the build procedure. What I want to focus on is building a standalone app for every platform separately. So every one of these platforms, Android and iOS, is going to have specific build steps. So let's go through looking at how to build for Android and then look at how to build for iOS. First up is Android. And so if we choose to build for Android, what we're going to see here is that when building for Android, you can choose to build an APK or an app bundle. Well, what's that, Mo? They're different types of binaries. They're different types of outputs that you can upload to the App Store. Now, app bundles are recommended, but you have to make sure that Google Play app signing is enabled for your project. So this is a more complicated step. If it's your first time building, they'll ask you also to upload a key store for Expo to be able to handle it for you. If you don't know what a key store is, they'll generate one for you. Otherwise, you can upload your own. So we'll let them upload it for us. And so if Expo uploads a key store for us, we have to run it later on with the fetch key store and back it up ourselves. That's recommended because they're storing it in the cloud on their end. And so making up a backup of your key store is extremely important because once you submit to the Google Play Store, all future releases must also be signed with that same key store. Think of it like a contract. And Google, once you release with that key store, is going to hold you to that key store. It's kind of like a contract. It's a file that contains information that's going to be specific to our application signing process. So Google just wants to make sure that you are the one signing. So first things first, let's go run Expo build Android. And so over here, if we open up our terminal, what we're going to see is that once I run Expo build Android, it's going to set up my project. So it's going to ask me, what would I want my Android package name to be? And it's going to give me an option, com.mobini.meals2go. So I'm going to accept that. And then it's going to say, what do you want to build? Do you want to build an APK, build a package to deploy to the store or directly to Android devices, or an app bundle? Build an optimized bundle for the store. Well, we're going to choose an APK because then we can install it directly on Android devices if we choose to. So let's choose that. Once this is done building your local JavaScript bundle, what it's going to do is it's going to upload your build to Expo over here. And if we go over to builds, we can see now it's been uploaded and it's been queued. So Expo is going to take over the build for us. We've built our JavaScript, our optimized JavaScript output, and now Expo is going to go through the steps of actually building our Android APK. And once it's done installing that Android APK, it will allow us to download that output so that we can go through the steps of actually deploying it onto the store. So as you can see here, it's at step 5 of 8. It's running Gradle. And with that, we can now keep track of all the builds that we do for Android or iOS. So right now, we're going through the Android build, and once the build is done, we can actually go through and download that APK, install it on the device. So let's wait for that build to finish. And of course, it gives you a link here where you can keep track of the build. And if we click that link, we can go to the same exact screen that I just showed you we were at, where we can see at which phase it's at. So once this build is finished, let's go through and see what we can do with the output of that build. While our build is running, we can also go and look at the specific logs so we can see what it's going through, what it's doing, starting the build process, getting the icons, resolving the native modules, reading the manifest, and then going through the Gradle build, which is Android's build tool of choice that's going to take all of the information, all of the native code, all of our JavaScript code, and build the output of our application. And once that is done, what we'll see is a build artifact. So what we have to do right now is wait for all 8 steps to complete. Once it's gone through all the steps, what we have here is what's called a build artifact. So it's taken all of our code and it's built out that APK, that Android package that we can now install on our phones. And if we click over here, we can see the logs of the build and see specifically what happened with the build. And what we can see over here in our builds is the actual artifact. So we're able now to download this by pressing this button. And what we'll get is the actual APK. So this is the downloadable file of our application. If we go to downloads and we take that APK and we drag it into our emulator, or you send it to your phone, it's going to install Meals2Go on our phone as a production build. So we're going to be able to now see over here, Meals to Go as a standalone application. It's no longer inside of that Expo framework. And if we press that, it's going to launch Meals to Go for us as a native app. So what we can see here is our splash screen coming in, and it's loading and optimizing all of the assets. We can see our app come in here with a nice background fade. And if we click login, what we can see is mo@beanie.io. And if we press password test123 and we hit login, we'll come into our application and we'll be able to see all of our information that we had previously loaded. And so now that our information is loading on our APK and we have everything ready for Android, one shortcoming that I need to show you is our settings panel will work as intended. But when we click the Maps integration in a production level build standalone app, we're running into an error. It won't render out the map. It just basically crashes the app. And this is because if we go over here to our Map View SDK, deploying a standalone app to Android, you have to integrate something called Google Sign-In or a Google Maps API key. If you've done the bonus section on the integration of Google Maps into our application, you know that you require payment information in order to set up Google Cloud in order to do this. And this highlights all of the steps that you would need to go through in order to integrate that Google Maps API key step by step and put it in your app JSON in order to get that crash to go away. Now, we're trying to showcase the app release procedure, and so we don't want to integrate this just for now, but be aware that certain packages that we use, for instance, the Google Maps package, in order to render our app, when we want to release to the Google Play Store, we'll have the additional requirement of needing to integrate Google Cloud as well and integrate the API key. And so you can always come back here and go through these steps specifically if you want to release a production grade app with a Maps integration to the app and Play Store. Now that we've built our standalone app for Focus Time and we're technically ready to release the prime time, there's one more thing we need to do. On the Google side, we need a developer account. And so when we choose to create a developer account, the Google account will be the developer account that's trying to join the developer pool, right? So if you are in an organization, do not use a personal account, but in this case, this would be your personal Gmail or just email in general. Now, a developer account, you'll need to pay a one-time $25 registration fee. So there are costs linked to deploying to the app and the Play Store. On the Google Play Store, it's a $25 registration fee for your app account. And they'll ask you for ID verification for your account registration. So there's more work that goes into actually getting your app ready for the prime time and all of the work that goes into setting up your developer account, making sure that everything is good to go. Now, if they can't verify your identity, your registration fee won't be refunded. So you have to make sure that you give them real information. Now, first you need to choose your public developer name. I can choose Mobini. They'll choose for a contact email address, a contact phone number. They'll ask you to confirm all of these fields, and then they'll ask you to create the account and pay. So once you go through that, what you'll see after that is, and I'll go through the registration steps and I'll show you what comes after. Once you go through the process of registering, they'll create a developer account for you, and then you can say, go to the Play Console. Now, once you're on the Play Console, it'll show you how to publish and manage apps. It'll show you a short video introduction of everything you need to go through in order to do this. And you can go next, 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 and you can say use the Play Console. And so over here, we're in the Google Play Console. This is where we can create an app for release. And if we say create app, we can give the app the name Meals to Go. We'll say it's an English app. We'll say publish it as an app. It's a free app. We can say confirm that it meets developer policies, US export laws, because it's a very simple app. We'll create the app. And then once we've created the app, now we can go into the management of the meta information for the app, set up the app, view the tasks. There's all types of things that we need to do in order to get our app ready for launch. And so as you can see, there's a bunch of tasks that we need to go through in order to get to the step at which we can actually upload our SDK and get it into the App Store. So in order for us to publish to the Google App and Play Store, we need to go from building that binary into the Google Play console and create our app and go through the task of filling in all of this information. And once we filled in all of this information, uploaded the APK, only then will it go into the review process. And once it's through the review process, that's when you get a yes or no answer from the Google Play people in terms of, you can release this, we need this additional requirements to be met, you're missing these things. So there's a back and forth here. There's no easy process to releasing publicly. And over the years, they've gotten more and more strict, more and more rigorous with all of the things that they need you to do in order to get your app on the Google Play Store. But here is a quick and simple overview of all of the small scale steps that you need to take in order to get to this phase where you need to just fill in information, make sure that everything is in the right order, and then you can release, right? So with that, here's a fast overview of how to get the right pieces in place in order to get to this place where all you need to do is fill in information in order to go through the release process. There's no simple way of skipping this, making this go faster. It's just a process of paperwork at this point that you need to go through. Now that we're aware of the process that we need to go through in order to get our Android app running on our phone, as well as getting the binary that we would utilize to go on the Google Play Store and go through the release procedure, we need to go through the same process for iOS. And so the way that we would do that is we would run expo build iOS. Now, you have to be aware that when we build for iOS, first of all, we need a bundle identifier. This is just an identifier that the app is going to use in order to know, hey, this is my unique name, my unique identifier. So we'll take the one that's auto-generated. And now we get to choose the build type. So for iOS, there are different build types. It's not an APK and an Android app bundle. No, it's an archive or a simulator. So we can determine whether or not we want to build in order to run a production grade app on our simulator, or we want to deploy the build to the store. Either process has different requirements. So if we go down the route of archive, now it's going to ask us, do you have credentials for Mobini in the project Meals to Go? Okay, so it's going to access the credentials. Do we have the access to the Apple Store account that will be used for submitting to the App Store? Well, now the question becomes, if we're in a live environment, if we're at a company, do we have access to credentials that are going to be used to deploy to the App Store? In this case, what we'll say is no. And now it says, no problem. We can auto-generate credentials if we don't have them to the main Apple account, right? But we can still set up for the upload credentials. So will we provide our own distribution certificate? So here is the process where we're saying, okay, we don't have the credentials to deploy to the App Store. They may be in the hands of marketing. They may be in the hands of a different department altogether. But now the question is, will you provide your own Apple distribution certificate? Well, in this case, we'll say, let Expo handle it. Okay, so now we have to enter your Apple Developer Program credentials. If you do not have an Apple Developer Program credential, what you need to do is you need to go over to developer.apple.com, and then you need to enroll in the program. Now you can enroll as an individual or as an organization, and this will enable you to release to the App Store. Luckily, I already have an account, so my Apple ID is this email. And for the password, I will quickly fill out the password. And so if I hit enter here, what it's going to do is it's going to authenticate against the Apple Developer Portal. And it's going to ask for access. So we're going to fill in our 6-digit code here that it's going to show us, 502992. And then it's going to request for a session. And what it's going to say is, now failed to prompt for all the credentials. Next time you build automatically, it will use the credentials. You have no team associated with your Apple account. Now we need to make sure that we have a paid Apple developer account. Do we actually have a paid Apple developer account? That is a good question. If we look at the status of the changes that it's made, well, now we're basically in a state where we need to make sure that we have an Apple developer account. Otherwise, we cannot even begin to build the output that is required to run our app on our phone. This is one of the cruxes of Apple development. So let me go and make sure that I have an Apple developer account. And so as you can see over here, currently I am not enrolled in the Apple developer program. Now, if you've subscribed to the Apple developer program, you can go through this. I can reapply to the Apple developer program. And so what I've done is I've gone through the process of renewing my membership. And so the same would apply to you if you tried to apply this Expo build iOS without having the proper account information. So let's go through this again. Now we're going to say no here, and we're going to say let Expo handle the process. Again, we're going to authenticate against the portal, and if authenticated successfully, it's now creating a distribution certificate and all of that stuff now that I have a valid Apple account. Again, will you provide your own Apple push notification service? Again, we're going to let Expo handle it. So we're going to go let Expo go through the process of setting up our Apple developer account, setting up everything that needs to be set up in terms of provisioning profiles and all of that good stuff. Now we've run into another error. Runtime error. Could not find app with bundle ID com.beanie.meals to go. Interestingly enough, it's run into an error. So if we go here to our bundle and certificates list, what we can see here is that we have an iOS distribution certificate. We do not have any identifiers. We have a device setup. But what we need to do here is we need to add an app ID. So let's add an identifier. So we'll add an app ID. We'll hit continue. We'll say app. We'll hit continue. And what we'll say over here is that the bundle ID needs to be com.mobeanie.meals to go. So we need to make sure that that's set up in our account. We'll say meals to go. Now we can determine what access it will have. We should allow something called push notifications. We should enable this. Register. And now that we've registered meals to go, we can try this process again. Archive. No. Let Expo handle it. And then we'll sign in. It's going to try to create the provisioning profiles again. It's going to try to optimize the assets. And now it's actually able to set everything up in order to release our application. So now it's built and optimized our resources, our source maps, and our code. And it's uploading our build over here on Expo. And what we can see if we go over to builds is that now a build has started for iOS. And so Expo is now generating the necessary files for iOS. So it's important to note here that we needed to set up the identifier in our certificates, identifiers, and profiles in order for Expo to be able to manage the output build. And once this is done building, we'll show you how to run this on your phone. Now that our iOS build is finished of meals to go, we can do the same thing we did on Android, and we can download the IPA file. This is the iPhone application file. So it's a bit different than what Android outputs because it's supposed to run on iOS. And when we download this file, what we can do or what we can try is to try to run it on our simulator. And the way that we would do that is if we go over here and we took our IPA file, we could drag and drop it into the simulator. And by dragging and dropping it into the simulator, what would happen is it would try to save it on the iPhone. Now, this doesn't work. This doesn't work at all. This is not how iOS goes and installs files. So it works fairly differently than it would on Android. This is not how we go about installing these applications. You can't just drag and drop an IPA file. So how do we run it on our simulator then? Well, what we can do is we can go back to Expo Build iOS and we can specifically save the simulator build. So this is going to create an optimized build specifically to run on the simulator. It cannot be opened on a legitimate iPhone, but you could drag and drop it on your simulator. So if we go back over here to Expo Builds, what we're going to see is that we've queued a build specifically for the simulator. And once this build has finished, what we can do is we can download the output and drag and drop that into our simulator. And so while this build is processing for the simulator, you may be asking, well, how do I run it on an actual device? Well, to test it on a device, you need to use something called test flight. And then you need to download the IPA file to your local machine, which we had already done. And with the App Store Connect, which is a specific app that you need to use in order to upload, you need to upload this IPA file into test flight. So there's a whole process here that can only be done if you have an iOS device, if you have a MacBook. You cannot do this on a Windows machine. You cannot do this on a Linux machine. So we're running into the limitations of being outside of iOS and the Apple environment. So now that this simulator build has completed, we can press the download button here. And what we're going to see is that where it downloaded an IPA for the production build, now it's downloading a tar.gz, so a zip file. Interesting. What will that zip file contain? And it's way smaller. And if we open that zip file up, what we're going to see is that it's going to output this meals to go that we can drag and drop inside of our simulator. And what that's going to do is it's going to install a simulator build of our production app. And now we can see meals to go running on our simulator. If we open that up, what we can do now is we can test out our application as if it was a production build that was coming from the App Store. And what we can then see is that we're able to test our application and all of the different aspects. And unlike Android, where we needed to set up a Google Maps key because Android works with Google Maps, the Apple Maps works out of the box and does not need those additional steps in order to function. So knowing that, we now know the different types of builds that we can generate for iOS. We can generate a production level build that can only be distributed through test flight to live devices, Apple test flight, or we can generate an iOS simulator build that can actually run on our simulator to test what exactly is going on. Now, with that said, this is the actual build that we need to submit to the Apple App Store in order to get that running. So let's take a look at how that would work. Now that we've tested our app bundle on our simulator, the question becomes, well, how do we test it on our device? But also, how do we release it to the App Store? And so if you go to appstoreconnect.apple.com and you log into your account, here is where you will do your submission. This is where you submit your app to the App Store. And if we go over to My Apps, you can create an app, a new app, and you can go through the submission process. As we can see here, I've set up Meals to Go. And if we click on this and we go over into Test Flight, we can see that this is where we can set up build testing for our IPA file. Remember the IPA file we downloaded that came inside the original build that we did, not the test run that we did in our simulator? Well, in order to test that file, we need to upload the build over here in App Store Connect Test Flight. So if we click on See Upload Tools, this is how you upload an IPA to App Store Connect. You can upload your binary with Xcode. You can upload them with the AL tool, and you can upload them with the Transporter app. Now, all of these different ways are basically similar, but you need a Mac app in order to do this. So if we go over here and we say download the Transporter app, and we say open in the App Store, what we can see over here in the App Store is the ability to install the Transporter app, which is going to upload the file into Test Flight. And so once we've installed this app, what we'll basically do is we'll go through the process of uploading the IPA file into Test Flight and then testing it on our phone. So opening that up, we'll agree to the terms of service, we'll sign in, and we'll say our account information, we'll fill that in, fill in our password. And then once we've signed into our Apple ID, what it's going to do is it's going to get to App Store Connect. We're going to add an app, right? Add app. And what we can do over here is we can say over in our downloads folder, we have the date modified and we have our IPA file. And if we open that IPA file, what we'll be able to do is upload that. So now we can click deliver. And so it's going to send it over to App Store Connect. Currently, it's verifying and analyzing the app output that was generated by Expo. And then once it's done doing that, based on the identifier and everything around that, it's going to send it over into our App Store Connect over here. And we'll be able to see it in our test flight builds. We'll be able to select it. And so as you can see, it's currently uploading the app to App Store Connect. And once it's uploaded the app, that's where we can go and connect our builds into test flight. So right now it's delivering the app. And if we go over here and we see what happened in the log, it basically uploaded. Now, if we go over here into test flight, what we'll be able to do is when we reload, we'll see version 0.0.1. So we've now uploaded a version into App Store Connect. And the way that it was connected is through that bundle identifier. When Expo built the version of the app, it built it with the same identifier that we set up when we initially set up our app in the Apple developer platform. Okay, so how do I test this on my phone now? So the way that we allow people to test our application is over here in the iOS build section of test flight, we can see that our build is currently processing. But if we go over here to the internal and external groups, what we can see is that as if we click on App Store Connect users, App Store Connect users can use test flight on all devices and all active builds. So if we add a tester, what we need to do is we need to add our admin account as a tester. Now, no builds are currently available as the current build is still processing. Once this build has been processed, it will become available in the test flight app. So we have to wait in order for the processing to be done. And once it's done, we can test out our application. Once our build has been processed by test flight, we now will get a confirmation email of an invite to test Meals to Go, because when there are no active builds, you will not get the invite. But once there's an active build to test, you will get an email inviting you to test. And if we say view in test flight, this will allow us to accept the invite to test our Meals to Go, which will install it locally on our production phone. And once we've installed Meals to Go, we can then go ahead and test it as if it was downloaded live from the App Store. So we're basically, through test flight, going to install and download the version that is going live on the App Store. And so if we test that out, mo@beanie.io, and we do test 1, 2, 3, what we can see here is that the app is the same that we were testing in development mode, but now it's a production build. It's very smooth, and it's very capable of allowing us to test out all of the different functionality that we would see in a production app. We were able to give feedback through test flight. Test flight is basically an app for quality assurance. It is what is going to go onto the App Store, but it's before the distribution to the App Store. So you could invite multiple testers. You could invite a bunch of different people before your app is actually submitted to the App Store to test it out. And the way that you would do that is to invite more testers. They would install test flight on their app, and then they would have the ability to test out the versions that are available. And so the version that we have right here can also be the version that we distribute over here, right? We could select a build, and so we can now submit multiple builds to test flight, and then we can eventually choose which one we're going to send with the submission for the App Store for review. And so the process here is kind of more rigorous and more secure than what you would see with, for instance, the Google Play Store. And that is intentional. The Apple ecosystem has more security parameters in place, a lot more process, but the flow is very similar in terms of all the information you have to supply in order to submit your application and all of these extra things you need to do to get your app ready for deployment. And so with that, we've seen how we can build for Android and deploy that on a phone to test. And we saw where we can deploy on the Google Play Store and all the information we need to fill in. We've seen how we can test on an iOS simulator, a production version of the app, as well as how to upload our app to the App Store Connect, test our app through test flight on a live production phone, and also go through the motions of seeing how those builds can be sent to different people to test, and adding testers and adding the ability to kind of have a more holistic process. So very different ecosystems, very different distribution processes, very different in general, but we built one code base, and now all we had to do was build two different outputs and follow the processes that are in place for both stores. Now, this is usually a process that is handled by a different department or by a more senior member of your team, so forth and so forward, or even automated, because you only do it once, and once you do it from there on, it's just about distributing updates. I hope this was useful. Always reach to the documentation of Expo, as it is very detailed and very useful for you to go through the process of the detailed steps that you may need to take.